Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Namatu acharyasa. So we'll we've gone through the community a few times with people doing readings from various different things, and there's a request to, or a suggestion to read from the new biography of Ajahn Chah, and thought I would begin with the chapter. Last year, of course, we did a lot of readings when it was still in manuscript form, and there's a couple of the chapters that didn't get read, and this one is one of them, and it's chapter 8, titled "From Distant Lands," and subtitled Luang Por and the Western Sangha. And then there's a footnote on that. Strictly speaking, it would be more accurate to use the word non-Thai or foreign here. A small number of Asian monks, mainly Japanese and Chinese, trained at Wat Pah Pong. However, the vast majority of the foreign monks have been from the West, and the Thai word used to refer to the non-Thais, Farang, is one specifically coined for Caucasians. For these reasons and for ease of usage, I have chosen to use the word Western Sangha. And begins with a Dhammapada quote. If by renouncing a lesser happiness, one may realize a greater happiness, let the wise renounce the lesser, having regard for the greater. Introduction. Farang. And that's like in Thailand, if you go walk around as and somebody sees you as a monk, and they'll say, "Oh, Prafarang." So it's this, Farang monk, and so it's a ordinary term, Farang. From the mid-14th century until its sacked by the Burmese in 1767, Ayutthaya was the capital of the Thai nation. Established on an island in the Chao Phraya River, it was ideally situated to act as an entrepot port at a time when land routes were safer than sea, and merchants in the Orient sought to avoid sending their goods through the Straits of Malacca. Within 200 years, Ayutthaya had become one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Asia. Its population of approximately 1 million people exceeded that of London. Some 500 temples, many with pagodas covered in gold leaf, lent the city a magical, heaven-like aura that dazzled visitors from other lands. By the mid-17th century, with communities of traders from France, Holland, Portugal, and England housed outside the city wall, the inhabitants of Ayutthaya had become accustomed to Westerners or Farangs. The kings of Ayutthaya often employed foreign mercenaries as bodyguards. To the Thais, these strange white beings seemed to resemble a species of ogre. Hairy, ill-smelling, quarrelsome and coarse, lovers of meat and strong spirits, but possessors of admirable technical skills, particularly in the arts of war. The ogres had a religion. Priests and monks accompanied them, but it did not appeal to the Thais, who were content with their own traditions. As Buddhists, They were accustomed to equating spirituality with the renunciation of sensual pleasures. They found the Western clergy worldly and hypocritical, undignified in their rivalries. The Ayutthayan Thais gently rebuffed what they saw as an alien faith with politeness and smiles. However, the legendary Siamese tolerance was stretched to the limit during the reign of King Narai, 1656 to 1688, when a charismatic Greek adventurer, Constantine Polkon, rose to become the closest advisor to the king, who appointed him Mahathai, Minister for Trade and Foreign Affairs, second in power and influence to the king himself. After his conversion to Catholicism, it is alleged that Polkon became involved with the French in plots to put a Christian prince on the throne and thus win the whole country for God and Louis XIV. At King Narai's death in 1688, however, conservative forces prevailed, French hopes were dashed, and Polkon was executed. For the next 150 years, the Siamese looked on Westerners with fear, aversion, and suspicion. But as French and British power and prestige spread throughout the region in the 19th century, the image of the Westerner changed. He came to represent authority and modernity, the new world order that had to be accommodated. As all the rest of the region fell into European hands, Siam's independence became increasingly fragile. King Mongkut, he reigned from 1851 to 1868, believed that the only way for a small country to survive in the colonial era was by earning the respect of the Western powers through becoming more like them. To that end, he began to reverse policies of previous monarchs and cultivated friendships with Western scholars and missionaries. He introduced Western styles of dress and uniform. He predicted eclipses by scientific means, undermining the hitherto unshakable prestige of the astrologers. He also sought to reform popular Buddhism along more rational, quote-unquote, scientific lines to protect it from the missionaries' disdain. After King Mongkut's death, his son, King Chulalongkorn, reigned from 1868 to 1910, carried on his father's policies and sought to create a modern, centralized state and administration, relying heavily on Western expertise. Members of the royal family and aristocracy were sent to study in the West, particularly to England. The policy was successful. Siam preserved its independence. At the end of the 19th century, however, the French humiliated the Thais by annexing their eastern territories. To many, this confirmed the West's unquestionable superiority in all things worldly. By the time Luang Por reached manhood, the wealthy Thai elite had become enamored with the material symbols of Western culture. Expensive imported clothes, motor vehicles, gadgets, and foods were the sought-after status symbols. The absolute monarchy was overthrown in 1932 in favor of a Western-style democracy that was soon displaced by a more potent import, military dictatorship. Fascism was the new vogue, far more appealing to the military men running the country than the messiness of political debate. The country's name was changed to Thailand. Chauvinism was promoted in the guise of patriotism. Cultural mandates accompanied political change. Field Marshal Pibun Songkram passed laws making it compulsory for men to wear hats and kiss their wives on the cheek before leaving for work in the morning. A marginalization of Buddhist goals and ideals coinciding with official support for Buddhist forms and rituals became a feature of development that was to become an enduring trait. In the hamlets of Ubon, images of the West came from Hollywood. Traveling movie companies set up their screens and loudspeakers in village monasteries, where Clark Gable and Greta Garbo enchanted their audiences in homely Lao, dubbed live in front of the screen. Thus, the first flesh and blood glimpse of Farang in Ubon, exciting though it was, came as a shock. During the Second World War, while the newly ordained Luang Por was studying in local village monasteries, a group of gaunt and ragged POWs was jailed in the center of town. They were prisoners of the local Japanese garrison, hostages against Allied bombing raids. The local people smuggled them bananas. Then, in the 1960s, came the Vietnam War. Ubon, closer to Hanoi than to Bangkok, attained a strategic importance. By the end of the decade, 20,000 young Americans were stationed on a sprawling air base north of the town. Large uniformed men, black, brown, and white, strode along the streets hand in hand with mini-skirted prostitutes. They caroused in tacky nightclubs with names like Playboy and sought to escape the stress of their lives with Buddha sticks. There's quotes around that. Overhead, at regular intervals, came the deafening sound of Phantom fighters and A-130 airships, taking off on missions over Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. American military personnel were not, however, the only young Westerners in Thailand at that time. It was during this period that villagers working in the fields to the east of Wat Pah became used to a strange new sight. Tall, fair-skinned young men with scruffy hair and dressed in T-shirts and faded blue jeans would often be seen walking along the ox track with a dogged, loping stride and with a large, grubby backpack, like a malignant growth behind them. These young men were the first trickles of the steady stream of Westerners who were finding their way to Luang Por Chah. They were to become the senior members of a Western Sangha, which now, more than 40 years later, numbers almost 200 monks and nuns. More than words. Luang Por, this is a quote, Luang Por, only a few of your Western disciples speak Thai, and you can't speak their language. How do you teach them? End of quote. This was one of the most common questions that Luang Por faced from the early 1970s onwards as the number of his Western disciples steadily increased. He would explain that he was teaching Buddhism not as a philosophy, but as a way of liberation. Pointing directly to the experience of suffering, its cause, and the way leading to its cessation were more important than finding words to describe the process. Sometimes, to clarify this point, he would pour water from the thermos flask on the table before him into a cup. In Thai, we call it, this is a quote, in Thai, we call this nam ron. In Lao, it's nam hon. And in English, they call it hot water. But these are just names. Dip your finger in it, and no language can really pass on what that actually feels like. Even so, people of every nationality know the feeling for themselves. On another occasion, a visitor seeing all the foreign monks asked Luang Por whether he spoke English or French or German or Japanese, to which, in every case, he replied that no, he could not. The questioner looked confused. How did the foreign monks learn anything then? Characteristically, Luang Por replied with a question. Do you keep any animals at home? Have you got any cats and dogs? Any oxen or buffalo? Yes? Well, can you speak cat? Can you speak cat language? Can you speak dog? Can you speak buffalo? No. Then how do they know what you want them to do? He summarized, it's not difficult. Training the Westerners is like training water buffalo. If you just keep tugging the rope, they soon catch on. To Thais, the water buffalo is the epitome of dullness and stupidity. Comparing a human being to a buffalo would normally be considered offensive. Anyone who calls someone kwai, that's a buffalo, to their face is either showing contempt or is spoiling for a fight. Given the exaggerated respect for the intelligence of Westerners common in Thailand, Luang Por's audiences would always find his buffalo comparison both shocking and hilarious. The sight of Western monks made a powerful impression. At a time when Western technology, material advances, and expertise were being so touted by the powers that be, here were to be found educated young men who had voluntarily renounced the good things of life that people were being encouraged to aspire to. These were men who had chosen to live austere lives in the forest as monks, not understanding the language, eating coarse food, striving for peace and wisdom in the same way that Thai monks had been doing for hundreds of years. It was baffling, fascinating, and above all else, inspiring. Many visitors would leave Wat Pah Pong thinking that perhaps there was more to Buddhism than they had supposed. If the Westerners had so much faith in it, how could it be outdated? Luang Por's basic technique was not, he insisted, particularly mysterious. He led his Western disciples, he showed them what to do, he was an example. It wasn't necessary to impart a great deal of information. It's a quote. Even though I have a lot of Western disciples living with me, I don't give them so much formal instruction. I lead them in the practice. Good actions yield good results, and bad actions yield bad results. I give them the opportunity to see that. When they practice sincerely, they get good results. And so they develop conviction in what they're doing. They don't just come here to read books. They really do the practice. They abandon whatever is bad in their hearts, and goodness appears in its place. The Westerners had come to Buddha's teachings and monastic life without the cultural conditioning of the Thais. In one sense, they had, quote-unquote, beginner's mind. Luang Por found their open, questioning attitude refreshing and stimulating. As students, they were largely free of the complacency that he considered such an obstacle for his Thai disciples. On the other hand, their need for explanations could make them susceptible to crippling doubts. Sometimes, questions led only to more and more questions, diminishing the intensity of their practice. The Westerners often came to envy the single-minded application of their fellow Thai monks, who seemed blessed with unquestioning faith in the teacher and the tradition. Luang Por said, Once you've got them to stop, these Westerners can see clearly how they've done it. But in the beginning, it's a bit wearing on the teacher. Wherever they are, whoever they're with, they ask questions all the time. Well, if they don't know the answers, then why not? They have to keep asking until they run out of questions, until there's nothing more to ask. Otherwise, they just keep running. They're hot. First disciple, Ajahn Sumedho. In 1967, a Wat Pah Pong monk named Venerable Somai returned from a Tudong trip to northern Isan with a monk who literally stood head and shoulders above him. Even the most restrained monks in Wat Pah Pong were unable to resist at least a surreptitious glance. The new monk was 6'2" tall. He's actually 6'4". He's probably 6'2" now. He's shrinking as in his old age, but he's 6'4". 6'2" tall, had a fair complexion, an angular nose, and bright blue eyes. His name was Sumedho. The two monks had met in a meditation monastery in Nong Khai province. Upon discovering that they were both Korean War veterans and that Venerable Somai spoke English, they had exchanged their stories. Ajahn Sumedho told Somai how, after the war, he had returned to college and gained a master's degree in South Asian Studies from Berkeley. Upon graduation, He had joined the Peace Corps and taught English in Borneo before moving on to a spell at Thammasat University in Bangkok. He said that it was after receiving meditation instruction at the nearby Wat Mahathat that his interest in Buddhism, first kindled by his readings of Japanese haiku poetry during his military service some 10 years before, had ripened into the decision to become a monk. Now, however, after moving to Isan, receiving full ordination, and spending the last several months in a small hut on solitary retreat, Ajahn Sumedho was beginning to lose confidence in the form of his monastic life and feeling the need for a more rounded way of practice. Venerable Somai's descriptions of Wat Pah Pong were timely and inspired him. He asked permission from his preceptor to leave, and before long the two monks were setting off together to walk the 450 kilometers south to Ubon. It would turn out to be a decision with far-reaching consequences. Ajahn Sumedho would go on to spend the next 10 years of his life in Ubon under the guidance of Luang Por. He would form the nucleus around which a community of Western monks coalesced. In 1975, he would establish the branch monastery, Wat Pah Ajahn Chah, before moving to England in 1977. There, at Chithurst in southern England, he founded the first of several overseas branch monasteries. When someone once asked Luang Por whether he had any special connection with Westerners that led to so many becoming his disciples, he replied with a smile that as a boy he had watched a cowboy movie with his friends. Images from it had stuck in his mind ever since, and perhaps they had exerted some kind of attractive force. One of the characters in the movie was this big man smoking cigarettes. He was so tall, it fascinated me. What kind of human being could have such a huge body? That image has stuck in my mind until now, and a lot of Westerners have come. If you're talking about causes, there was that. When Sumedho arrived, he was just like the cowboy in the movie. What a long nose. As soon as I saw him, I thought to myself, this monk is a Westerner. And I told him that I'd seen him before in a movie. So yes, there were supporting causes and conditions. That's why I've come to have a lot of Western kith and kin. They come even though I can't speak English. I've tried to train them to know the Dhamma as I see it. It doesn't matter that they don't know Thai customs. I don't make anything of it. That's the way things are. I just keep helping them out. That's the gist of it. When Sumedho asked to be accepted as a student, Luang Por agreed, but made one condition, that he fitted in with the Thai monks and didn't expect any special considerations. At the other, this is Ajahn Sumedho speaking. At the other monasteries in Thailand where I'd lived, the fact that I'd been a Westerner had meant that I could expect to have the best of everything. I could also get out of the work and other mundane things that the other monks were expected to do. I'm busy meditating now. I don't have time to sweep the floor. Let someone else sweep it. I'm a serious meditator. But when I arrived at Wat Pah Pong and people said, he's an American, he can't eat the food we eat, Luang Por said, he'll have to learn. And when I didn't like the meditation hut I was given and asked for another that I liked better, Luang Por said no. The whole way of training was that you had to conform to the schedule. When I asked Luang Por if I could be excused from the long Dhamma talks, which I didn't understand, he just laughed and said that you have to do what everyone else does. Maybe I'll leave it there and go into long quotes.
Sadhu, 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 anumodam. Luang Por, I was wondering if you remember the first things that Luang Por Chah taught you, tried to teach you in the first few months when you didn't speak Thai.
Let's see. Not really. I think it was sometime after when that he, we actually had any kind of conversation. I remember what the first thing he said to me when I first arrived, which is definitely a teaching, that because I went and I had ordained already. I went as a fairly newly ordained monk from the city, and arrived at Wat Pah Pong early morning after Pindabat before the meal. Paid respects and bowed, did my 3 bows, and then he just sort of sat quietly for a while. Was looking at me and then said, "If you want to stay here, you have to stay at least 5 years." So that was my first instruction, which I didn't follow. It was sort of after about 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and I was just like, the idea of 5 years was just beyond my comprehension. 24 at the time. I was just learning a bit, ordained as a Buddhist monk to learn a bit more about meditation. I had places to go, things to do.
I wonder, I think I may have heard it before, but it's relatively unusual that that Westerners, Luang Por Chah's Western disciples, go by their Pali names. Mm-hmm. So the whole book is talking about Ajahn Sumedho, but I imagine he probably wouldn't have used that name when he first arrived at Wat Pah Pong, or did he?
Probably.
Yeah, okay.
Probably did.
I'm just curious. I think I may have heard a story about when Luang Por decided that his Western disciples would go by Pali names.
Okay. If you've heard the story, I'd be interested, because I haven't.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust what I've heard. I'm just curious. Okay.
Can we go back to that first question? So you said after a bit you left, and then did you come back and did you realize, okay, I guess I am going to do 5 years, and you came back?
Yeah. No, I went off and stayed at a small meditation monastery, and I had kind of perfect conditions to meditate as much as I wanted, and I did. And I did a lot of. So I went to. That was in January. End of January, I think I went, because it wasn't that long after I ordained. So probably end of January. And I was there through Magha Puja, which really made an impression on me in terms of the Sangha gathering. And because in those days, that was the day that all the students of Ajahn Chah would gather at Wat Pah Pong. And but then, just the idea of 5 years was really weighing on me, and so I went off and stayed at this meditation monastery, and I practiced meditation very diligently. and it had good results. But then as I just kept thinking of Ajahn Chah, and so that as it was getting closer to the rains retreat, then I asked the teacher there, the abbot of the monastery, if I could. Well, actually, I'd already written to Wat Pah Pong and received a reply back that I could return to Wat Pah Pong, and then I asked permission from the teacher, the abbot, and then he said, yeah, spend the rains retreat here, and after the retreat, and I've got a teaching engagement. I'll take you to Wat Pah Pong myself. So I said, yeah, sure. So I did. So then after the rains retreat, then I went to Wat Pah Pong. And that was just saying, I just kept thinking of Ajahn, for all the practice and meditation, I really just kept thinking of Ajahn Chah. So, okay, I just have to go back and give myself to him.
Do you remember any specific qualities or impressions that kept recurring that drew you back during that time?
Nothing's hugely specific other than it was just like he is somebody who was genuine, and not just him personally, but also what he had created in terms of Sangha, in terms of a monastery, of like monastic Sangha, but then also as a model for like a wider Sangha of the monastic and the lay community. So there was a real involvement of the in practice of the monastery wasn't isolated or separated. It was really very central to lay people's lives in the area. So that made a huge impression. So all those things were things that, one, he was personally charismatic, but it wasn't just my draw to him personally that made a big impression. It was all these other things. Yeah.
How many months were there at that time, and when was the first branch monastery from Wat Pah Pong developed?
The first monastery from Wat Pah Pong was established years before that. I can't remember how many years. That would have been, say, when I went, it would have been 1973, 74, and early 74. And by that time, there was probably already a dozen or more branch monasteries. The first one would have been established at least, it says even before Luang Por Pasanno arrived there. So maybe 10 years before that. The early disciples of Ajahn Chah, Botiang, Bojang, Sinuan, they all had branch monasteries already. There were monasteries that were. Let's see, when Luang Por Pasanno first arrived, there might have been maybe 3 to 5, not much more than that, 3 or 4. Because some of the early monasteries after there are people who showed up, like Ajahn Mahamon came when Luang Por Pasanno was there. So a well-known disciple. Say, Wat Nana Chat was established in 1975, and that was the 19th branch monastery. And numbers of monks, when I first arrived, it was quite a few, probably 30 or 40 maybe. It was a big Sangha.
How many of those were Westerners, do you recall?
Maybe half a dozen, maybe 4 or 5, I think.
So for the Nana Cha, were some of them at those branches as
Yes,
well?
some would be out at branch monasteries. Say like when I first went, I didn't meet Papakro. He was out at one of the branch monasteries. When I first went, I think Paul might have been, Paul Brighter, or Warpanya might have been there. So yeah, I mean, there people were out at branch monasteries. That was very common. You would stay for a while with Luang Por, and then you'd be off to a branch monastery. And back and forth. Especially during the rains retreat, Luang Por would. I mean, he was. People wanted to be close to him, so as it got close to the rains retreat, the numbers at Wat Pah Pong would be swelling, and then he'd send people out to the branch monasteries, and they'd spend the rains retreat, and then they'd start trickling back and trying to hang out at Wat Pah Pong, being close to Luang Por Chah, and he'd send people out again.
Were there branch monasteries that you were sent to or that you stayed at?
Yeah, I got sent to a branch monastery in Ayutthaya, which was branch monastery number 20. So it was established right after Wat Nana Chat, about the same time. But then I came back, and then I spent a couple of years at Wat Nana Chat, and then I spent a full year at Wat Pah Pong. So I spent my early time at Wat Pah Pong. And actually, I didn't even go to Wat Nana Chat thinking I was going to stay. I didn't actually really want to go, but I was working on I didn't really want to be with Western monks, actually. But I was working on a bowl staff for my bowl, and I'd hit a bit of a wall in terms of I needed some help, so I went over and where I could, because I didn't have enough Thai to get it explained to me, so I went over to Wat Nana Chat and I was working on it to get it finished and go back to Wat Pah Pong for the Pansa, and then I got sick. It was like the others had arrived in about March, and then I went over in something like June or something like that, just for a short visit. But then I got sick and was in hospital for a week or 10 days, and then when I came out of the hospital, I was like 115 pounds. So going back to Wat Pah Pong was not. So I better go back to Wat Nana Chat and get some strength back. So I ended up spending the Vasa. Okay.